In September 1931, the fishing trawler Kalinda was dragging its nets 25 miles off the Norfolk coast when it hauled up a compressed block of peat from 120 feet below the surface. The ship's skipper struck it with a shovel. Inside the peat, perfectly preserved, was a carved antler harpoon, 8.5 inches long, barbed, and unmistakably the work of human hands. The seafloor was not empty. It had never been empty. Beneath the cold, trafficked waters of the modern North Sea lay the drowned remnants of a country, a continent-scale heartland of forests, rivers, and human settlements that had been erased so completely that modern history had simply forgotten it was there. That country had a name given to it by later researchers, Doggerland, and its end did not come quietly. Around 6,200 BCE, submarine landslide off the coast of Norway displaced 3,500 cubic kilometers of material into the Norwegian Sea and sent a wave train screaming across the North Atlantic. What it did to the people still living on the last fragments of Doggerland was not a gradual process. It was an afternoon. The harpoon from the Kalinda Hall sat in a museum for decades as a curiosity. Pollen analysis of the peat surrounding it eventually confirmed it had been deposited in a terrestrial environment, meaning the object had once rested on dry land in a marsh or on a riverbank before the sea claimed the ground beneath it. The peat itself was freshwater peat, not marine sediment. That single test was the first forensic proof that an inhabited landscape now existed underwater. That what geographers had always treated as open ocean had once been inhabited, productive dry land. Since 1931, commercial trawlers working the same waters have recovered thousands of additional objects from the North Sea floor: flint arrowheads, stone axes, adzes, and nearly 2,000 carved barbed bone and antler points. These were not isolated curiosities. They were the material residue of a functioning society, tools manufactured, used, and discarded across generations on ground that no longer exists above water. The scale of what was lost is difficult to hold in a single frame. At its maximum extent, during the cold depths of the last glacial period, Doggerland was not a narrow land bridge connecting Britain to the European continent. It was a vast, continuous plain, topographically diverse, ecologically rich, and geographically central to the entire northwestern European region. The rivers that now drain into the southern North Sea once flowed through it. The Rhine and the Thames converged inside this landscape and ran south together through what researchers call the Channel River, a separate system in the north and east identified through seismic survey and named the Schotten River, to drained the area around the Doggerbank Highlands and emptied into a large freshwater body called the Outer Silver Pit Lake. These were not small waterways. They were the organizing features of a continent. The question of how we know any of this at all, given that the landscape has been submerged under 50 to 100 meters of seawater for thousands of years, is itself part of the story. The answer involves oil companies, acoustic physics, and a lobster. The warming that followed the last glacial maximum transformed Doggerland from frozen mammoth steppe into a fundamentally different landscape. As global temperatures climbed through the early Holocene, the permafrost fractured, rivers swelled, and vegetation advanced northward across the exposed seabed at a pace measurable in human lifetimes. Within a few thousand years, the arid tundra that had supported herds of woolly mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses gave way to a dense, temperate mosaic of rolling hills, marshlands, estuarine mudflats, and freshwater lagoons threaded by large meandering rivers. Pollen and botanical evidence recovered from submarine peat layers documents this transformation in precise botanical sequence. Early pine forests were gradually displaced by thick deciduous canopy: oak, hazel, alder, elm. These woodlands supported dense populations of aurochs, red deer, elk, wild horses, and wild boar. The estuarine margins and coastal wetlands produced shellfish, waterfowl, and migratory fish runs. No comparable concentration of terrestrial and aquatic food resources existed anywhere else in northwestern Europe. Doggerland was not peripheral to the human world of the early Holocene. It was the center of it. That center was not permanent. Sea levels had been rising since the end of the glacial maximum, driven by the continuous melting of the great ice sheets. The lowest river valleys flooded first, then the coastal plains. What had been a single continuous landmass fragmented over millennia into an archipelago. By the time the catastrophe arrived, the highlands of the Doggerbank, the highest ground in the region, may have already been fully submerged or reduced to a low, wind-scoured island sitting just above the waterline. The 8.2K cooling event compounded this slow diminishment. Around 8,200 years ago, a sudden global temperature drop, driven by a massive pulse of glacial meltwater into the North Atlantic, arrested the ecological development of the landscape. Isotopic and paleobotanical evidence from sediment cores shows a regression in the temperate flora. Thermophilous species like hazel and oak contracted, while cool-tolerant birch and pine advanced. The food base that had supported dense human populations for millennia became leaner, less predictable, and more difficult to exploit. The people living on the remaining fragments of Doggerland were already under pressure when the wave arrived. The human occupation of Doggerland did not begin with the Mesolithic. It began nearly 1 million years before the tsunami, and the evidence for its earliest phase is direct, physical, and irreducible. On the Norfolk coast at Happisburgh, a series of fossilized footprints was discovered preserved in the compacted mud of an ancient river estuary. Sediment analysis and pollen stratigraphy dated them to between 850,000 and 950,000 years ago. The tracks belong to a small group, adults and children, estimated between 90 and 170 centimeters tall, moving through an estuarine environment at the margin of a large river. The species responsible is widely attributed to Homo antecessor. These are the oldest known hominin footprints in northern Europe, and they were found not on a distant savanna, but on what was once the coastal margin of Doggerland. For the hundreds of thousands of years that followed, the exposed landscape served as hunting ground for Neanderthals during successive glacial cycles. The cold, arid conditions of the Pleistocene converted the seabed into a grassland steppe populated by woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, and saber-toothed cats. Neanderthal groups hunted these animals here, manufactured stone tools here, and died here. Commercial vessels working the Middle Deep area, roughly 15 to 20 kilometers off the modern Zealand coast, have dredged numerous Middle Paleolithic flint hand axes from the seabed, confirming sustained Neanderthal activity in the region over an extended period. The most personal artifact from this deep chapter is a skull fragment, designated Kryn. It is the only Neanderthal fossil ever recovered from the drowned landscape of Doggerland proper. It is a robust parietal bone identifiable by the characteristic thick brow ridge of its species. Isotopic analysis of the cranial fragment confirmed that Kryn was heavily carnivorous. His diet was built on the large herbivores of the mammoth steppe. High-resolution scans of the bone also revealed something more intimate, a small cavity behind the brow ridge identified as a benign subcutaneous tumor. A Neanderthal who hunted mammoths on this ground, who lived with a growth behind that ridge of bone, and whose skull was eventually recovered from a sea that did not exist during his lifetime. The Mesolithic populations who inherited this landscape arrived as the Holocene warming took hold, and they were not the simple, transient foragers that earlier accounts assumed. The site at Boldner Cliff, a submerged Mesolithic settlement now sitting 11 meters underwater in the Solent, off the Isle of Wight, was discovered in 1999 when divers noticed a lobster excavating its burrow and discarding worked flint tools onto the seafloor. What excavations subsequently recovered from the anaerobic, waterlogged silts of that site rewrote the accepted timeline of British prehistory. The inhabitants of Boldner Cliff were heating flints to high temperatures and using them to carbonize large oak timbers, a controlled industrial process for woodworking that was previously believed to have been introduced by Neolithic farming cultures more than 2,000 years later. The site yielded worked wooden platforms and hollowed timbers consistent with boat construction. Among the finds was the oldest known piece of string recovered in Britain, formed from twisted plant fibers. Sedimentary ancient DNA extracted from the site silts detected the presence of einkorn wheat, a domesticated grain not native to the region and not yet cultivated in Britain. Its presence implies these Mesolithic communities were connected through maritime trade routes to Neolithic farming groups operating somewhere on the European mainland. At Howick on the Northumberland coast, a pit house dated to approximately 7,800 BCE documents a different dimension of Mesolithic life, one that pushes back against the older image of perpetually nomadic foragers. The structure was built from a conical framework of birch poles reinforced by a ring of pine logs, with interior hearths containing fire-cracked stones and a sunken floor designed to retain heat through coastal winters. The investment of labor required to construct and maintain this building is inconsistent with a transient camp. Some researchers have proposed that its architectural scale and relative isolation suggest a ceremonial or communal function rather than simple domestic occupation. Comparisons have been made to the large communal sweat lodges documented among North American groups. Isotopic analysis of an 8,300-year-old Mesolithic jawbone recovered from the North Sea deposits, specimen DOG-009, confirms a diet drawing on both terrestrial game and marine or estuarine resources. Human bone fragments from the same deposits carry deliberate post-mortem cut marks, and the research attributes these to ritual defleshing, the processing of human remains as a mortuary practice, suggesting a society with deep symbolic relationships regarding the treatment of the dead. The same people who built boats, manufactured string, traded wheat with distant farmers, and invested significant labor in permanent or semi-permanent architecture were also managing their dead according to deliberate protocol. By 6,200 BCE, the Doggerland that the Mesolithic populations inhabited was a remnant of a remnant. The continuous plain of the early Holocene had been reduced by thousands of years of incremental sea level rise to an archipelago of low islands, coastal marshes, and intertidal zones. The forest canopy that had blanketed the interior was underwater. The river systems that had organized the landscape and its human occupation drained into the sea from what were now coastal margins rather than inland hills. The highest remaining ground, wherever it was, sat only modestly above the waterline, exposed to storm surges and tidal variation in ways the interior landscape of previous centuries had never been. The populations that remained were concentrated on the coastal margins, exploiting the estuarine and intertidal resources that had always supplemented their diet. These zones, rich in shellfish, migratory fish, and waterfowl, were productive, but they were also the most exposed terrain on the landscape. They sat at or near sea level. They had no elevation to retreat to. The 8.2 K cold event had been running for decades, compressing the canopy, reducing prey populations, and stressing the food base across the entire region. The people were adaptive. Thousands of years of occupation across a radically changing landscape had selected for flexibility and resilience. But resilience has a threshold, and the world these communities occupied in the final decades before the wave was already diminished beyond recognition from the world their ancestors had known. The Storegga Slide was not a single crack in the seafloor. It was a catastrophic structural failure spanning approximately 290 kilometers of the Norwegian continental shelf edge, and it occurred in a geological instant. The primary trigger was almost certainly a significant tectonic earthquake. The seismic shock destabilized the methane clathrates, dense, solid compounds of methane gas locked within a crystalline water lattice under extreme pressure at the base of the continental shelf. When the pressure differential ruptured those compounds, the methane expanded violently and the entire face of the shelf failed. Approximately 3,500 cubic kilometers of sediment dropped into the abyssal plain of the Norwegian Sea. That is enough material to bury Scotland under several meters of mud. Yet the displacement generated a wave train. Not a single wave, but a rapid sequence of long-period, high-velocity pulses radiating outward across the North Atlantic and Norwegian Sea and funneling south into the shallow North Sea basin. The wave front crossed the open ocean in approximately 3 hours, reaching the Faroe Islands, the eastern coast of Greenland, and the coastlines of Britain and Scandinavia within that window. On the Norwegian coast directly facing the collapse, the event began with a drawdown, a sudden violent withdrawal of the sea as water was pulled toward the failing mass. Estimates put the initial sea level drop at up to 20 meters, exposing kilometers of bare seabed before the first wave arrived. The subsequent run-up heights varied drastically by location. At the Shetland Islands, the wave reached between 20 and 25 meters above sea level, with local topography pushing some estimates to 30 meters. In western Norway, run-up heights of 10 to 12 meters have been documented in coastal lake basins and sediment stratigraphy. In eastern Scotland, the wave drove estuarine sediments 29 kilometers inland, with run-up heights of 3 to 6 meters recorded in the Firth of Forth. What it did to Doggerland was more complicated and in some respects more terrifying than a clean wall of water. The shallow bathymetry of the southern North Sea basin does not behave like open ocean when a long-period wave enters it. As the wave front encountered the gently sloping, submerged terrain of the former Doggerland landscape, its behavior was not uniform. In open areas where the remaining topography had already been submerged and smoothed by years of marine sediment accumulation, the wave energy was partially dissipated. In channels, the drowned river valleys, the estuarine bottlenecks, the narrow inlets between what remained of the Dogger archipelago, the wave energy was focused and amplified. For the low-lying marshlands still above water, the event likely did not arrive as a visible breaking wave. It arrived as an extreme, violent tidal surge, water rising faster than anything in human experience, and driven by immense hydraulic pressure, tearing across the landscape as erosive overland flow. The distinction is not semantic. A breaking wave is visible. It announces itself. An extreme surge moving across flat coastal terrain in the dark or in fog, or at the edge of an estuary where the water is always close, offers almost no warning and no high ground to reach. The physical evidence is preserved in sediment core ELF 001A, recovered from a submerged valley in the southern North Sea in work conducted by the Europe's Lost Frontiers project. At a specific stratigraphic horizon corresponding to approximately 8,150 years ago, the core reveals the classical signature of a tsunamiite, an erosional unconformity at the base, where the waves scoured the existing seabed clean. Above it, a chaotic layer of ripped-up peat clasts and fragments of ancient forest floor carried offshore by the surge and its backwash. Above that, the finding upward gradient that a tsunami leaves as the water pools and loses velocity. Coarse gravel at the base giving way to fine sand, then silty clay at the top. The frozen record of a single afternoon's violence settling out of suspension over hours and days. The microfaunal record within the layer confirms the violence of the mixing. Deep marine benthic foraminifera, organisms that live on the ocean floor, were torn from the seabed and redeposited alongside shallow water and terrestrial markers. Tests from organisms dating between 12,000 and 27,000 years old appear in the same layer as material from the surface. The wave did not simply move water, it inverted the stratigraphy. Sedimentary ancient DNA extracted from the core adds the biological dimension. At the precise tsunami horizon, the SIDA DNA record shows a sudden massive surge in woody terrestrial taxa, the genetic signatures of trees and forest floor material. This is not the gradual accumulation of organic debris that normal marine sedimentation produces. It is the genetic fingerprint of a coastal forest being physically ripped from the ground and swept offshore, its biological memory buried under meters of marine sediment in a single event. Demographic modeling for the populations living in intertidal and coastal zones at the time of the wave's impact estimates mortality rates of up to 100% for those in the lowest lying areas. The wave struck during the harshest decades of the 8.2K cold event. The populations had nowhere higher to go, the reduced food reserves, and no precedent in any living memory for what was coming. The coastal resource base, the intertidal zones, the estuarine fisheries, the shellfish beds, was physically scoured from the landscape. Even for those who survived the wave itself, the terrain they returned to was unrecognizable and largely unproductive. The tsunami did not only kill people, it destroyed the ecological infrastructure that made continued occupation of the remaining land possible. Everything we know about Doggerland came back involuntarily: a fisherman's net, a lobster's burrow, acoustic surveys commissioned by petroleum companies to find oil deposits beneath the North Sea floor. None of this evidence was preserved by intention, and almost none of it was recovered by design. The primary tool for reconstructing the drowned landscape is 3D seismic reflection mapping, a technology developed for the hydrocarbon industry that sends controlled acoustic pulses deep into the Earth's subsurface from survey vessels, then records the reflections that bounce back from geological boundaries where sediment density changes. By measuring the two-way travel time of these reflected pulses and converting the raw data into voxel models, three-dimensional grids of volumetric pixels, researchers can digitally strip away the modern seafloor to reveal the shapes of prehistoric river valleys, glacial moraines, and marshlands buried under thousands of years of marine sediment. The resolution of these maps is approximately 10 meters. That is fine enough to identify a river confluence or an estuarine bottleneck. It is not fine enough to find a hut, a hearth, or a midden. That gap between the landscape we can reconstruct and the human occupation we cannot directly see is where most of Doggerland still lives. The topographic logic of where Mesolithic settlements should be located is well understood. River confluences, sheltered bays, transitional zones between woodland and open water. These are the places where hunter-gatherer communities concentrated across every continent and every period. The seismic maps identify dozens of such locations in the submerged landscape. Almost none of them have been reached. Marine archaeology in the North Sea operates under conditions that make terrestrial fieldwork look entirely straightforward by comparison. The water is cold, dark, and heavily trafficked by commercial shipping. Visibility on the seafloor is measured in centimeters. Storm events routinely disturb and redistribute surface sediments. The anaerobic conditions that preserved the organic materials at Boulder Cliff, the wood, the string, the cDNA, exist only where the sediment has remained undisturbed and oxygen-free for thousands of years. Identifying those zones, reaching them, and excavating them without contaminating the very DNA evidence that makes them scientifically valuable is a logistical problem that current technology has barely begun to solve. The cDNA extracted from cores like ELF001A has already demonstrated the potential of the method. It has identified temperate woodland species, alder, oak, elm, thriving in the landscape more than 16,000 years ago. It has detected the presence of domesticated wheat in a Mesolithic settlement that should not have had access to it. It has documented the abrupt biological signature of a tsunami in a single sediment layer, confirming in molecular terms what the physical stratigraphy recorded in coarse gravel and ripped peat. What it has not yet done, because the cores that would be required have not yet been taken from the right location, is document a specific settlement, a specific household, a specific set of cultural practices from a particular point in time. The harpoon the Kalinda hauled up in 1931 came from somewhere specific, a particular place on a particular riverbank deposited by a particular person. That person had a diet, a kinship group, a set of practices around death and memory, possibly a boat, possibly a relationship with farming communities hundreds of kilometers away. The sediment that surrounds the place where that harpoon rested for 8,000 years still contains the biological record of everything that lived and died nearby. The Storegga wave buried that record under meters of marine sediment in a single afternoon. It compacted it, sealed it in anaerobic sediment, and preserved it far more completely than open-air exposure ever would have. What the wave could not do was destroy it. It is still there beneath the North Sea, beneath the shipping lanes and the fishing grounds and the oil infrastructure. It is still mostly unread. The country is still waiting.